All right, first things first, we need to clarify a few things. So when we created a big structure in the HTML 101 course, and let's just change this over from plain text to HTML. And by the way, I'm using VS Code. If you're using a different editor, all I did was go to File, which is just outside of my recording area, and then New File. So Command N or Control N will create a new file for you. And it automatically thought it was a plain text file, so I clicked down here where it used to say plain text, typed in HTML, and selected HTML. And that just gives us nice little goodies like this. We can do HTML:5, hit Tab for autocomplete using VS Code, and it gives us a bunch of stuff in here. So I'm going to actually go ahead and delete some of this, and I'm going to call this HTML201. Now, we learned at some point that we have a paragraph, we could put some lorem ipsum in there, and we could say, for instance, that this should be underlined. Something like that. Now, if I save this as, let's go in here and name this index.html. And I just saved that into a particular folder that I had called HTML201, and I called it index.html. But if I open up Google Chrome or any sort of browser, whichever your favorite browser is, you can go to File and then Open File. So Control O or Command O. Go to my folder here and let's just open this up. And we can see that this, once I zoom in, is underlined. And that's cool, it does what we want, but unfortunately underline is deprecated. So it was okay to learn this a little while ago just because we needed to make that underline, but there's a better way to do this. And the better way to do this would probably be to add a span in here. Let's go ahead and change this to a span element. And all this is a simple inline element. And you should be familiar with block elements versus inline elements at this point. And what we're going to do is work with this style attribute. And this style attribute allows us to write CSS. So you don't need to actually know too much CSS right now, but if you want underline, I would say maybe try to memorize this particular one. I tell people all the time, you don't need to memorize too much. I mean, you can always Google it, how to add underline using CSS. That'll work as well. So I'm going to do text-decoration : space underline. Now, if I save that, go back to my page and refresh, it should look like nothing changed. And that's perfect. And I can always check by right-clicking and clicking inspect, and you can see in my inspect tool down here that there is in fact a span with text decoration underline, and if I wanted to, I can actually toggle that on and off now, which is really, really nice. So moving forward, whenever we use underlines, let's go ahead and use text decoration underline instead of using the U element, just because the U element is deprecated. It's from old versions of HTML, and CSS can now do this, and we prefer to use CSS whenever we can. Okay, let's take a look at internal links. So actually, let's recap first. So how do we create a link? We create a link, and I'll make this just a touch bigger here. We create a link with the A anchor at element and the href attribute, and that could go to http website.com, go to website.com, and this is just going to show us a little link up here, and it's going to go to website.com, whatever is on that site. So that's how we create a link. But what if we wanted to link to something else in the page? So let's go ahead and actually make this page look a little nicer. So let's say h1, welcome to HTML201. And let's create a link. And we don't know what this link is going to be yet, but we know it's going to say, scroll to bottom of page. And we can get rid of this one because that's not necessary anymore. That was just an example. So now when I do this, I click scroll to bottom of page and it does nothing. It's because it's going nowhere. You can see that there's no href in there. There's no hyperlink reference. So let's say we had this really, really long page. And let's go ahead and copy this a bunch of times. And I don't really care too much about the formatting at this moment. I just want the page to scroll like this. And I want, when we click the link, to go to the bottom of the page and maybe have a link at the bottom of the page to bring us back up to the top. So let's do that. Let's say there's going to be, let's say like an H3, and we're going to give this an ID. And this is a unique identifier for this element. So it should never have two of the same ID in the same page. So let's call this bottom, and this is the bottom of the page. And when I refresh, you can see it just says the bottom of the page. Nothing happened. The ID didn't do anything particular. But if we go back up to our link, we can actually type in $ID. Now, whatever that ID is going to be. Now, that ID that we wrote was bottom. Go down here, ID is equal to bottom. Save that, and I'm just going to refresh up here. And you can see my link actually changed color. And you can actually see it says index.html, bottom. And when I click this, boom, it brings me to the bottom. So it doesn't do a smooth scroll, but it does jump me to the very bottom of the page, which is actually quite important for long content pages. Now let's go ahead and create a link to bring us back up to the top. So maybe let's remove this as an H3 and let's make this a little more hidden. Let's create a div in here. And you can see we're going to be getting a little more advanced with this. ID is equal to bottom, but we know IDs can or should be completely unique. So let's go ahead and get rid of this one. We can actually get rid of that whole line. And let's put a link in here that's going to go back up to the top. Back to top. Now, because this is an internal link, this needs an ID somewhere on the page called top. So let's scroll back up to our code here and let's give this an ID of top. And let's refresh our page and give this a shot. And that zoomed way out for me. I want to zoom back in. And this should scroll me all the way to the bottom. Boom, just like that. Or not scroll, but jump me to the bottom. And this should jump me back up to the top. Just like that. So now we have internal links. What I would like you to do is create a page that's long enough that you actually create a scroll bar here. Or what I did was, because this page actually wasn't very long, you can always just open up your inspect tool. And if you shrink it, or if you bring it up high enough, it'll sort of shrink your viewport. And you'll have a scroll bar and you can test it out that way, like this. Go ahead and give that a shot. Once you're ready, let's head on over to that next lesson. Let's take a look at favicons. Favicons are these little icons that show up right next to your page title. Now, we don't actually have a favicon set. We have a title, which is cool, but what if we want something a little bit custom? We can actually add that as well. We can customize it to be whatever we want. Now, typically, it should be an image that's 32 pixels by 32 pixels, so it's pretty small. I'm not exactly going to follow that rule because I know it's going to shrink it down, but if you want it to be properly sized, maybe have proper translucency or transparency or anything like that, then yeah, you're going to want a 32 by 32 image, but I'm just going to use a random image that I have from the Coding for Everybody branding. So let's open up our code here. And in our head, what we're going to create is the link element. And we can do link : favicon. And it gives us all sorts of stuff in here. Now, by default, it wants us to use a .ico. That's an older format. We don't have to do that. We can use, let's say, a .png. Now, this is just like linking to an image or a CSS or a JavaScript file. We actually need to make sure that this works. And you'll notice that we're using 3 attributes here. So we've got the link element, we've got the rel, or the relation, like what is it? It's a shortcut and it's an icon. A hyperlink reference to wherever that image is going to be, and then the image type. Now, we don't want the image type to be X icon, we want the image type to be PNG because I'm going to be using a PNG. Likewise, if you're using a JPEG, it would be JPEG, alternatively JPEG with an E, but we're using PNG. Now, it's at this point, I might actually want to use my editor a little bit more. So what I would like to do is, instead of just having one file open, I'm going to open this whole folder. I'm going to go File, Open. I'm going to go to my desktop where this folder is, and I only have index.html in there. Let's go ahead and open that. And it really looks like it didn't do a whole lot, except added this Explore bar. Now, if that Explore bar does not show up, you can always go to, where are you? It's somewhere in here. View, Explorer, right there. View Explorer, that'll always turn it on for you. So let's click index.html, and this is just the page that I was working on. And in here, I also want some sort of image to link to. So I'm going to open up my Finder. I'm going to copy this particular image. I came prepared to this lesson with an image called Coding for Everybody favicon.png. I'm just going to copy that entire name. And you can see as I copied it into that folder, VS Code was like, oh, there's a new file. Okay, let's put that in there as well. Now we can preview it. So this is what the image is going to look like. And all I have to do is, because I copied that file name, I'm just going to paste that file name. And we're not using slashes or dot dots or anything like that. We're not using this or, let's say, Favicons. We're not doing anything like that. We want to make sure this is in the same folder as our index.html, just to keep this simple for now. And you can tell it's in the same folder because we're in the HTML201 folder over here, and there's index.html and coding for everybody favicon.png. Let's go ahead and save this. And let's refresh this page. And you can see that Favicon now showed up. Now, if you're using another browser and it does not show up, that could be because of one of two reasons. There's a typo, and you haven't actually added the image properly. I'll show you how to debug that in just a second. Or there is caching. And I know browsers like Microsoft Edge like to cache pretty hard. So you might actually have to do a hard reload or open up another browser just because your browser is going to try to get this image once and then try to cache it for a very, very long time. Now, if this doesn't show up for you, let's go ahead and do this. QWERTY doesn't show up in there, and you can actually see with my inspect tools open, there's one error. If I go over to my console, you can see network error file not found, and it's looking for QWERTY coding for everybody favicon .png. And that just simply does not exist. So if you open up your inspect tools and there's a typo in there or the file doesn't exist, you'll see the error right there. And I'm just going to undo that. And there we go. We have a favicon. So if you're following along with me, what I would like you to do is find a small little image, something like this, and add it as your favicon to the page that you're working on. All right, let's talk about something that's kind of complex and kind of tricky, because this one is going to trick a lot of people for a very long time, including myself. And I'm talking about pathing. So we've put everything into one particular folder right now, but what if we wanted another folder? What if we wanted to move our favicon into a folder called images/favicons? And we could just click and drag that right in there. And so we've got a folder in here called images, and then another folder called favicons, and then a file in here called coding for everybody. So in that last lesson, we created a favicon. But when I refresh the page, we're going to see that we get that error file not found. It does not exist because it's not in that same folder anymore. It's not in the same folder as index.html. But what we can do is we can say, go to the images folder / the favicons folder / and then our file name. So let's go ahead and save this, or refresh anyways, and yeah, that shows up for us. So that's pathing. That's how we get into a path. So we just said folder name / another folder name. And by the way, don't use spaces. I know a lot of Windows users like to use spaces, but in things like this, do not use spaces. It's a lot easier if you use underscores or dashes, but please don't use spaces. You're going to run into a lot of problems. So folder name / folder name / and then the file name. Simple as that. Now let's go ahead and add an image into just the images folder here. Not the favicons folder, but just the images. So let's go ahead and go to unsplash.com and let's get an image of a computer because we're working on computers. Good enough. And let's download this one for free. Let's get the small version of this one because that's all we need. I would like to say thank you to Glenn Karstens Peters. This is a sweet photo. Thanks for letting me use it. Let's go ahead and show this in the Finder. And I'm going to open this up. I'm just copying this file. Let's go ahead and throw this into here. And I'm going to rename this to computer.jpg. And in my editor, you can actually see this turned into a proper folder now. And now there's subfolders in here. But in images, I've got a folder called favicons and a folder, or not a folder, but an image, a file called computer.jpg. Now, I'm going to get rid of a bunch of these P elements because, well, we don't really need them. And we're going to make this page long anyway, so that internal link to the top and the bottom of the page is going to work perfectly fine. Eventually. Probably not right now because the page is kind of short. But let's go ahead and add an image. And that src is going to be images. That's the folder name. And then the file name is computer.jpg. Let's give it an alt, computer, and that's it. So if we go back to our page and we refresh, we can see this image shows up now. and that's in the images folder. Now, again, if that doesn't work for you, let's just make sure that you always have things typed properly. It is case sensitive. So if your folder is called images lowercase, do not write images uppercase. That's just not going to work for you. So let's do images break me, and let's refresh. We can see the alt text shows up there, and in my console, you can actually see error not found. So that's pathing into a folder. Now let's say someone goes into the images folder, because we can do this. We know that HTML 201 is a folder. We also know that images is a folder. So let's do this. Let's go to /images. And we can actually see that we have Favicons, a folder, and we have computer.jpg. But let's say we actually wanted something to show up here. What we can do is go into our images folder, create a new file. We want to call this index.html, and that just means use this page by default. This is the default page that your browser is going to look for, so even if you don't land on this page, it's going to try to use this page anyways, just by default. My VS Code is set up to use Django templates by default, but let's change that to HTML5. And let's do HTML:5. Images folder is going to be the title name, and in the body, let's just say, hi. All right, so I just refreshed the page there. We have this index.html file, and it's not showing our page by default, but this is a good practice because once it gets onto a server, index.html is going to be the page that shows up by default. So it's going to look just like you clicked into it, just like this, but it's not necessarily going to say index.html. That's not a thing you need to really remember at this point in time, but it is a cool little thing that you can do with live servers, live websites down the road. So now we have this index.html file in our images folder. Let's link up a page. So let's say H3, this is the images folder, and let's create a link in here, an anchor link with a hypertext reference. And we're going to use a relative page. So we're going to say go up one folder, and that's how we do that. We go ... up one folder. If we needed to go up one more folder, because this is already in the images folder, we need it to be outside. We could do ... slash ... Every one of these you can actually see is going up a folder in my computer. Now I don't want any of that. I just want up one, and I want to be able to select not the images folder, but index.html, and that's going to be referencing this one here. The naming gets a little bit confusing because we have two index.html files, but that's okay. And VS Code was smart enough to figure out what we were trying to do. Go back home is what I'm going to say in there. Let's refresh this page. Let's make this just a bit bigger. And we can go back home, and when I click it, it goes back to the HTML 201 homepage. So that's pathing in a nutshell. To move up a folder, use ... To move into a folder, you don't use the ... You just specify the folder name / subfolder name, if there is one, / and then your file name. And that is pathing in a nutshell. Okay, let's take a look at tables. Tables are wildly important to us right now because they're going to enable us to actually create some sort of layout for our page. Now, admittedly, layouts aren't really created with tables anymore. This is a very old way of doing things, but because we don't know CSS and we don't know JavaScript yet, this is the only way that we have. And that is 100% acceptable because even though we're going to be using tables in a way that's not really used anymore, we are going to be learning all about how to use tables properly because they're still used for things like feature sets or pretty much any government website because they all still use tables for some reason. Yeah, so tables are still used. Emails use tables all the time. It's a really important skill to have. So I'm going to go down here, and in this lesson, I'm just going to show you how a table is created, but we're not actually going to do anything with it yet. So don't feel like you have to code along with me. So a table is a table element, just like this. And inside of this, we have table rows called TRs, or I can do TR and then tab. We can have another table row, TR tab. And then inside of each table row, the cells are called table cells, or TDs, table data cells. Cell 1. And let's go in here and do TD. Cell 2. And by the way, if you're sort of just new to this course and I'm going a little too fast for you, what I did there was I could type in table, and because it's an HTML element, I can type in table, and as soon as I see that Emmet abbreviation, I can hit the tab key on my keyboard, and it just creates it into HTML elements for me. So now we're getting into some nice nesting, and in HTML 101, we learned all about nesting. So we know that this whole thing is going to be a table, including the child and grandchild elements. This whole thing is a row, including its child element, and this single element here is going to be a cell. And this one is going to be cell 2. And if we just refresh our page here, scroll on down, we can see cell 1, cell 2. Nothing fancy really happening there. It doesn't look like anything's happened, but what if we give this a border of 1? We now actually have a table. We can do more with this too. We can say the width is going to be 100%. And it takes up the whole thing. We could add another cell. And this one's going to be cell 1.2, I guess. And we could add cell 1.3. And we can go up, so on and so on. So anyways, we're going to get into this in much more depth in the next couple of lessons, but I just wanted to quickly show you that this is how we create a table. Let's take a look at table rows and cells. So to create a table, we do this, table/table. And that is all we really need to do to create a table. But inside of a table consists of two primary elements, a table row, and that's what TR stands for. TR is equal to a table row. And inside of each row, we have cells or table data cells. So a TD is equal to a table data cell. And so let's do TD tab, and let's create our first cell. First cell here. And let's flip on over to our browser and just hit refresh. We're going to see our first cell. No, we can't actually see it. We can inspect it if we wanted to. And we can see that we are in fact in a table, and our browser is smart enough to say, hey, there's actually supposed to be a body here. So wrap the TRs in a T body. So this actually goes one level deeper. So it goes table, T body, TR, TD. Now I don't have to write the T body because I'm assuming that everything that I'm writing is going to be in the table body anyways, and the browser is making that same assumption. So we can shortcut it that way. Now to see our progress, I always like to throw a border on here and then just get rid of that border later. So let's do a border of 1 and a width of 100%. Let's refresh, and now we can see we have our first cell. And if we go ahead and add a second cell, this is going to be side by side, which is something we weren't able to achieve with block elements in HTML 101, but now we can. And we can keep doing this, so on and so on. So instead of second cell, we could do third cell, and we can keep adding more and more and more. Now I'm going to get rid of that third cell. I'm going to copy this whole thing over. Actually, I'm not going to copy it. Let's write this out by hand, because this is good practice to write this out by hand. TD, row 2, cell 1. And if I do another TD, hit tab, row 2, cell 2. And there we go. We have first cell, second cell, row 2, cell 1, row 2, cell 2. And that's how we create table rows and cells. Now, what I would like you to do is give this a shot. I want you to create a 2x2 table. Create 4 cells, so you have 2 rows, 2 columns, and 4 cells in total. Go ahead and give that a shot. Once you're ready, let's head on over to that next lesson where we dive a little bit more into tables. Let's take a look at merging cells and rows. So this gets really, really interesting, and it's not actually super intuitive at first, but it gets a little easier the more you do it. So in the last lesson, we created a 2x2 table, 2 rows, 2 columns. In this one, we want to create a 3x3. So I'm going to do a table here, and I want to see my border. I want to see my progress here. And I'm going to change that width to 100% because I want it to take up as much space on my page as possible. I don't really want to leave any extra space off to the right. Now, for good measure, we could always do a T body if we wanted to. I didn't do that in the last lesson. I talked about it, didn't do it. That's okay. I'm going to do it this time just to show you that we can do it. So we've got a table row here. We know that this is going to be our first table row. Second row, third row. And all I'm doing is hashing this out. I'm roughing this out. I'm making it a little bit easier to work with. And now I need, because I have 3 rows and I need 3 columns, let's go ahead and create TD, 1, 2, and all I'm doing here to copy the whole row is Command C, Command V, or Control C, Control V. And I'm going to select all of that, copy that, paste it, and paste it in there. So let's go ahead and take a look at what our table now looks like. We've got row 1, row 2, row 3. or actually those are columns, I got that backwards. So column 1, column 2, column 3, row 1, row 2, row 3. Now, there's a way to merge cells together, and we can do this actually in a very interesting way. We can do col span, so column span is equal to 3. So we have to take a look here. How many columns do we have? 1, 2, 3. We can span 3 columns. But let's go ahead and save this and see what happens. This number 1 in row 1 takes up 3 spaces, but now there's 2 more cells in here. Now, if you ever see something like that, you can safely delete those extra cells because they're not needed. We said col span of 3, so take up 3 column widths. And then we also had some old HTML in there, and we just got rid of that. When we refresh our page, we're going to see that row 1 takes up 3 columns now. Now let's go ahead and merge this 1 and this 2 together. No, let's not do that. Let's do this 2 and this 3. So we need to go down to row 2. So we've got row 1 here. Let's do row 2, and we want to merge these 2 together. So we can say col span is equal to 2 because we want this to take up all of number 2 and all of number 3. Let's go ahead and save that, refresh, and now it's taking up that extra spacing as well. Now let's go ahead and merge this 1, so row 2 cell 1 and row 3 cell 1. Let's go ahead and merge those together. So we can actually merge pieces of rows together as well. So in here, because we want to merge downwards, let's do a row span of 2. And let's see what this looks like if I don't adjust this. You can see it displaced another cell, which is not what we want. So we still have 1, 2, and 3 in row 3, and we don't want that. Let's go ahead and just delete that row 1 because we've got a 1 here, and we have a 1 here. We don't need both of them. Let's just delete this one. So delete, save, go back to our browser, refresh, and look at that. So we've got 3 column widths in our first row. Over here, we've got 2 column widths. In here, we have 2 row heights. And we do that with these attributes called row span and col span or column span. Now, this is going to be really important to your final project. So what I would like you to do is give this a shot. Do exactly what I did. Create a 3x3 table and then start merging rows and cells together and see how it displaces cells, and then try to delete the proper cells and just make it actually work the way you want it to work. Go ahead, give that a shot. If you get stuck, don't forget you can always ask questions down below or in the Facebook group called Learning to Code. There's over 56,000 members. We can help you within just a few minutes of posting a question. Go ahead, give that a shot, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Okay, welcome back. Let's take a look at table widths and cell widths. So I'm going to delete that table from the last lesson, create a new one, and let's give this a border of 1. And let's just create some default content in here. We've got a table row, table cell, cell in here. Standard table, we should be somewhat familiar with that by now. So if I go over to my browser, and this is from the last video, if I just refresh, I've got a cell in here. It's not taking up very much space. Maybe I want it to take up 50% of the space on this page. And so if I just zoom out, you can actually see it's super, super tiny. And what I can do is I can say width is equal to 50%. So far, I've been saying width is equal to 100%, and it takes up all this width through here. But now I'm saying actually only take up 50%. And I can go into responsive mode here, and I can see that as my page gets smaller, so does that table. Now that's actually super, super hard to see because that's super, super tiny, but it is becoming smaller and smaller. So it is maintaining that 50% width. And all I did there was click this little icon in Google Chrome, and that sends me into responsive mode. So you can see how things are going to look like on tablets, on mobile, things like that. Now I'm just going to zoom back in here, and let's change this back to 100% because I want to use more width so I can take up more real estate just for demonstration purposes in the video. It just looks a little bit better. You don't have to follow exactly what I'm doing. So I'm going to add a second row in here. And let's say I had a cell in here and I didn't want it to take up exactly 50% of the table. So what our browser here is doing is saying, hey, there's a table. It's 100% width. There's 2 cells. 100 divided by 2 is each one is 50%. That's all it's doing here. But let's say I wanted that first one to be smaller. We could say in here, width is equal to, and let's give it a 20% in here. Now, before I show you what that looks like, I also want to mention that you can get rid of the percent sign and you can do this in pixels as well. Now that's a little bit harder. It's a little more hard-coded, not always what you want. Percent is usually what people are looking for. But you could also say, instead of a width of 100%, you could say a width of 500 pixels. But I'm going to stick with percentage for now. So I save that, refresh my page, and you can see that this cell actually got smaller. Now you're probably thinking, well, what's the use of that? But if I do this, I can do a new table row, a new cell in here, and I can do colspan of equal to, it's supposed to be equal to 2, so it's like there's 2 of them, but it's going to be merged together. Welcome to my website. And in this one, the one where the width is only 20%, we could say something like H3. Let's put this on new lines so we can read it. H3, navigation, and in here we could do H3, content. Let's go ahead and refresh this and we can see welcome to my website. That's like the title of my page. We've got navigation, so we can make a list of links in there and we can put some content in here. So now we're working on an actual layout. Now what I would like you to do is create a table, and with just one particular cell, I want you to tell it exactly how wide it should be. Give it a width. And as a recap, all we did there was add the width attribute to either the table or the cell. In my case, I did both, so the table's 100% width. And then I said the cell should be 20% of that table width. Okay, let's take a look at table headers. Now this one's actually super easy because we've been using the TD element for table data cell. Let's go ahead and use a table header. And all we do here is TH. And I'm going to change this to an HTML file. TH represents a header cell in a table. Let's go ahead and change the closing tag as well. And you're going to see from the last lesson to this lesson, this is what it used to look like. And this is what it's going to look like as soon as I hit refresh. It's now centered and bold. That's a table header. And that's really all there is to it. A table header works the exact same way as a table data cell. The only difference is instead of TD, we said TH. That's it. Nice and short. Once you think you got a hang of that, let's head on over to that next lesson and I'll meet you over there. Okie dokie, welcome back. Let's take a look at inline CSS. Now we actually already covered this in the very first lesson where we said style is equal to text decoration underline. We can do that on pretty much every single element in the body of our page. And by body, I mean the body element. So any element in here, we can add that style attribute to. So let's go ahead and create a div. And in here, let's give it a style attribute. And let's change a few things. And I'm just going to give you a little glimpse into CSS. So let's give it a padding of like 40 pixels. Let's give it a font color of white. And a background color of, let's say, black, so we can read it nicely on the screen. And in here I can say lorem tab, and that's all I'm going to do. So you can actually see the syntax here. And at this point, I probably don't need to explain this syntax to you anymore, but just for good housekeeping, let's go through it anyways. So I created a div, space, style is the attribute, is equal to, and then I have everything between quotation marks. Then I've got a CSS declaration in here. So this whole thing is a declaration. You don't need to remember the CSS part, by the way. But this is a CSS declaration. We're saying add padding 40 pixels to the top, right, bottom, and left. Change the font color to white, background color to black. And in between each of these declarations, such as this one, we have a semicolon. So it's a little different than HTML, but still very, very readable. And this whole thing here is called inline CSS. So let's go back to our page, and I'm going to hit refresh. And look at that. With just a little bit of effort and knowing just a tiny amount of CSS, we were able to create a padding in here. So we've got spacing here, over here, over here, and over here. We change the background color to black and the font color to white. We can also right-click Inspect. And if I click on this particular element, we can toggle these on and off. This is what padding does. We can change that padding to be higher or lower if we wanted to, which is what we're doing here. And all I did was click in there and I hit the up arrow or down arrow. You can also type if you wanted to. If you wanted to, you could scroll all the way down in this little window here, and you can see that it'll tell you right away that there's a padding of 40 on all 4 sides. And that is inline CSS. That's really all there is to it. And we can write all of our CSS in there. Now, that's actually not a very good way to do it, but occasionally you're going to see that that's actually going to be required. And this is just something that you should be very aware of. Now, this CSS, again, at this point in time, do not feel like you need to know this. After you're finished HTML 201, this course, definitely feel free to pick up CSS. I have a course on CSS called the CSS Masterclass. It's a huge, huge course. It goes through everything you could think of. But for now, let's just keep focusing on HTML. Now, if you want to follow along and do exactly what I did, go ahead and pause the video and give us a padding. Remember, it goes whatever we're trying to change, colon, space, and then a value, and then a semicolon. And then what we're trying to change, like the color, colon, space, and then the value, and then a semicolon. And that's how we put 3 in a row like that. So feel free to give that a shot or not. And when you're done, when you're comfortable, when you're ready, let's head on over to that next lesson. All right, as we dive more and more into HTML, we're going to end up transitioning a little bit more into CSS. And in this lesson, I want to show you exactly how we can do that right away. So in the last lesson, we looked at padding, color, and white color and background color of black. Now let's say we wanted to add that to another div. And so we could write another div in here, and we could fill this with some lorem ipsum, and then we would have to copy and paste this. Like that. Which is not a big deal, but if we have that 20 or 30 times, and then we have to make one change to all of them, so let's say we needed to change white to blue, and change white to blue here, we have to do that 20 times. And that gets really, well, for lack of a better term, it gets really irritating, and it takes way too long. There's a better way to live your life. So I'm going to, first of all, create another div here, and these could just as easily be paragraphs. And let's go ahead and see what we have on our page. We've got a lorem ipsum, and a lorem ipsum. So we've got 1, 2, and 3. Now let's say I wanted to apply this styling to this third one, but not the second one. What we could do is we could actually pull this style attribute out into a style element. Now it just happens to be that they're named the same thing. You can't necessarily pull an attribute name out and turn it into an element and just hope that it works. But in this case we can, so it's just coincidence there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of that, delete it, come up here, paste that in my style. And so this is not going to do anything, but what I'm looking at here is reusability. So I have this div and I have this div, and I want to be able to give these 3 attributes, these 3 CSS attributes to both of them. And we can do this with a CSS class. And we can say class name here. I'm just going to select those 3, move them back up, put them in there. And so this syntax looks a little weird. We're not going to spend too much time here, but the class starts with a dot, then the name. There's no spaces or anything in it. It is case sensitive, curly brackets, and then the stuff we put inside of our style attribute that we now put into a style element. And what we can do here is I'm going to copy this, but first and foremost, I want to show you that when I refresh the page, nothing happens. My console's not breaking. It's not complaining. I just have 3 divs with lorem ipsum in it. And what I want to do here is say, in this first one, class is equal to class name here. And you can see VS Code is trying to autofill that for me. And I could also do class is equal to class name here. And so instead of writing style is equal to padding is 40 pixels, color is white, background color is black, instead of writing that twice, we wrote it once. Looks a little different. And we said class is equal to class name here, class is equal to class name here. Now when I refresh my page, I save that and refresh the page, you'll see that it applies the styling to both sections for me. Now, careful with typos here because I'm using uppercase and lowercase characters here, but if you don't do it right, and I purposely typoed that one, it's not going to show up. But your console's not going to complain either. So you have to keep an eye out for that. Make sure you're typing things properly. If that means you type slower, that means you type slower. That's okay. Now, the other thing with classes is we can add multiple classes. So we could add another class here, call it uppercase, and we could do text transform uppercase. Now, I already know these because I write a lot of CSS in my day-to-day life. But VS Code is also pretty helpful here. So as soon as I typed text, you can see it's trying to give me all sorts of different options in here. There's a lot to CSS. Again, you don't need to memorize all of it if you don't really want to. You can always just figure out how to Google it. As long as you can figure out how to get the answer, that's what's important. But going back to classes. So I have a second class here. Again, class starts with a dot. That's what this means. It's a lot like saying dot is equal to, or up here, it's a lot like saying class is equal to. We just use dot as a shorthand sort of method. And then let's make one of these uppercase. And we can add uppercase to the second one. Now, we need to add a space in here. If you don't add a space, it just looks like this. And your browser is going to think that the class name is called class name here uppercase, like all one word. It's not. It's class name here, space, and then uppercase as well. And we can add more and more and more if we wanted to, as long as they actually do something. So I've got class name here, space, uppercase. And when I refresh this, we should see that this inherits the same styling, but should also be all uppercase. And look at that. It's like it's shouting at me. And that's all there is to really classes in HTML. A class is a reusable piece of code. It has this little dot here that says it's a class. It has this sort of syntax. Again, you don't need to know this part at this point in time. Please focus on the HTML. The HTML that we want to focus on is the attribute called class and how it works. We can have one class name, space, second class name, space, third class name, so on and so on and so on. Okay, welcome back. We have one more thing to cover when it comes to CSS, and it's this idea of an ID. And we've actually done this when we were creating internal links. So we can create a link that goes to bottom, or like this one, a link that goes back up to the top of the page. But we're using this ID attribute here, and we can actually style things based on an ID as well. So in the last lesson, we took a look at classes. Classes use a period. But if I scroll on back down here, you can actually see that an ID, like I'm linking here back up to the top, ID is equal to top. But down here, I'm still linking to it with a number sign top, and that's going to bring me back up to ID top. Now what that is saying is basically number sign is equal to top. ID is equal to top. It's the same thing. So if we scroll on down, inside of our style attribute here, we can create an ID. Testing ID. And in here, and you'll see that it starts with a number sign. No spaces, no special characters. It's just regular text in here. So don't try to get too fancy with your class names or your ID names. In here, we could do something like border, 5 pixels, solid red. Let's actually make this a lot more obnoxious and do 15 pixels solid red. Now, out of the box, this is not going to do anything because we haven't applied this particular testing ID anywhere. Let's go ahead and add it to this middle one. So we've got 3 divs here. We've got a top div with class name here, bottom div with class name here and uppercase. And in the middle, we have ID is equal to, scroll up, testing ID. And you can see that these both match right here. Now, the thing with IDs is they are supposed to be 100% unique. Now, browsers don't always honor that, but JavaScript will always run into a problem if you have 2 IDs that are the same. So you don't really need to know what that means at this point in time, but what you do need to know is an ID is just like your driver's license. There should only ever be one copy of it. There should only ever be one version of it. That's your ID. So let's go back to our browser here, and when I hit refresh, we're going to see a 15 pixel red border around here. Just like that, super obnoxious. So just like classes, we can select things by IDs and then add styling to it. And that's where this ID attribute comes from. Now there's nothing to do here. Don't worry, you don't have to actually know all of this right now. You're going to get tons of experience with this in CSS and JavaScript when you go and learn those things. But for now, again, let's just keep focusing on HTML. It's just good to know that there's a class attribute and an ID attribute, and this is how it works. Oh, and one last thing, you don't add multiple IDs here. So like how we have class name here, and then a space, and then uppercase, and that is selecting this stuff and this stuff. With an ID, we don't do that. With an ID, we just say there's one single thing in here. So we don't do testing ID and another one and another one. We don't do that. We just say there's one. So let that sink in for a couple of minutes. Feel free to meet me over in that next lesson and we'll get back to HTML. Okay, welcome back. Let's take a look at a few different ways to format code. Format code or code formatting. The first way is this pre-tag, P-R-E. And if we just hover over that long enough, MDN is going to tell us that the pre-tag is a pre-element that represents a block of pre-formatted text in which structure is represented by a type of blah, 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 blah. The most important thing here is that it represents pre-formatted text. Some stuff here, and let's go ahead and let's just check out what this looks like at first. So that's near the bottom here. And look at that. It actually did something weird. It added a bunch of spaces. So in HTML 101, if you remember, I preached about this a lot. HTML, or not HTML, but your browser does not care about whitespace. However, there are a couple cases where it does. Pre is one of those cases. So the pre tag is very white sensitive. And what if we did a second line here? Second line here. Now in regular HTML, we need to add a BR or some sort of block element to get onto a new line like this. But we actually don't need to do that. Not in a pre tag anyways. In a pre-tag, look at that, shows up perfectly. Now the thing to keep in mind is that the pre-tag cares about white space. So let's go ahead and add a bunch of spaces here. Make this just look real terrible. It also lines up our text, by the way, so it doesn't really matter what our default font is because our text editor is going to try to make sure that every font is mono, or every letter is monospaced, so that H is the same width as E, is the same width as R, is the same width as E, is the same width as I, is the same width as Z, is the same width as M. Yeah, you get the point. In the pre-tag, it's going to do the exact same thing. Whereas if you look at here, that R is not as wide as the F. Whereas here, the S-O-M-E, they're all the same width. Even the spaces are the same width. That is called monospacing. So that's one way to format your code. Another way to format your code is, if we wanted to do something inline, because pre is a block element, we could say, let's add some lorem text here, code, /code. And this is going to be inline for us, and this is going to make it look a little more code-like, a little more like this. And look at that. It actually took lorem ipsum dolor sit, I don't know. And it formatted it a lot like this. Now, is it white space sensitive? Let's explore. Let's add a bunch of spaces between lorem and ipsum. This one is not white space sensitive. Would you look at that? But pre is white space sensitive. So that's a good distinction to keep in mind. So I'm just going to undo that because that's not needed. And those are two ways in which you can format your code. So you can write some code like this. It's still going to try to render HTML inside of it. Don't forget about that. You're still going to need HTML entities. That's a thing we'll talk about in the future. But you can still format your code like this or like this. Block element, inline element, pre, code element. Okay, let's take a look at HTML entities. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at pre and code elements. And let's say I wanted to put something in here, like B, this is bold. And let's say I actually wanted to display this. I didn't necessarily want to just say, like, this is bold text. I wanted to actually show this tag. Now, we're going to run into a problem. When I hit refresh, it just bolds my text. So it's still rendering regular HTML, and that's not what we want. We actually want this tag to show up. Now, we have these things called HTML elements. And an HTML element starts with an ampersand, or the and ends with a semicolon. And it's really just shortcuts to show less than, greater than, copyright, things like that. Now, there are so many of them, I cannot possibly cover all of them, and you're going to have to do a little Googling for it. But we can do less than, which is this symbol here, B, and then we can do ampersand, greater than, GT. And this looks really, really weird, but what this is going to do is turn it into that, and this one is going to turn it into that. But only while we're displaying it. So let's go ahead and refresh our page. And we can see that this now actually shows up. Let's go ahead and copy this whole thing over to our closing B tag. And let's add a slash in here. Look at that. So our text is no longer bold and it's showing us the HTML tags. Now we can do the same thing, the exact same thing, inside of our code element that we used in our last class or last lesson. Same thing. And we don't have to do it inside of the code element. We could do it really anywhere. It doesn't really matter. You'll see down here it says B, this is bold. So that's an HTML element or an entity. And an entity, all it is taking some sort of way of regularly reading the code that your browser would try to interpret and showing it the way you want to show it in a human readable way. Now, a really good example is if we were to add like a footer to our page here. So let's say this is our footer. We could say something like, and copy, and then we could put the year in here. So we could put like 2022, if that's the year. Scroll on down, and there it is, a copyright. Now, just for funsies, I'm going to throw in 2 extras here. We can do sup for super, and that makes it up. So it brings it up a little bit instead of being centered. And we can also do sub, S-U-B, for subscript, superscript and subscript. And that brings it down. So I'm going to undo that. Feel free to play with those if you like to, but they're not really necessary. I just thought I would throw them in there for fun because they're sort of working along lines of copyright. Copyright's usually that little tiny C at the top of a line. You'd use superscript for that. Okay, let's talk about forms real quickly. Forms. Now, we are going to be spending a little bit of time on forms, but it's not actually going to be incredibly useful to us. Forms are how we send data to a server, but we don't actually have a server. Just because we've opened an HTML file in our browser does not mean it's a server. A server usually runs a programming language like Python or PHP, Java, C, some other proper programming language. We're using not a programming language. HTML is not a programming language. It is a scripting language. And thus we don't have a server. We don't need a server to run it. However, forms are important for creating contact forms, update forms, login forms, sign up forms, forgot your password forms, things like that. Now, a form typically looks like this. You have the form element. You have some sort of method, and you can actually see that it's suggesting 2 here. Well, 3, but really you're going to be using get or post for the most part. Let's go ahead and use get, and the action is going to go to somepage.html. Now, just as an example here, let's go ahead and create a button, and the type is going to be submit, and we'll cover all of this individually as well. Submit this form. And if I go back to my page and refresh and click submit this form, watch what it does to my URL. It goes to somepage.html. So it changed the page for us, which is kind of cool. And it would try to also collect the information from the form and put it in the URL, which is not great for passwords or credit cards or things like that, but it is a good way to work with forms when you're just learning. Now let's take a look at what else we can do with a form. And again, you don't need to follow along with this. We'll cover all of this on its own. So input, we've got an input and we can do a text area. And I just let my VS Code, my editor, autofill stuff so it would show me things. This is an input field. It's one single line, like your email or your password or something like that. And this is a text area, like you're adding your address. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of this individually. What I'm going to do is just delete that because it's not going to be useful in the next lesson. All I wanted to do here was show you, hey, this is how forms work. And in the next lesson, we're going to actually get started with forms. Okay, welcome back. In the last lesson, we took a look at what a form does. An action. We don't want this to go anywhere. Let's just do this. Let's make it go to the same page we're already on. So when we have certain elements like input, text area, or button, oh, there's one more actually, select. We're going to cover all of these individually. But when we have these should all be wrapped in a form element. Now this is sort of mix and match. You can do what you like. There's not a lot of rules to it, as in you don't have to have an input text area button then select. You can mix and match these in any way, shape, or form that you like. But let's start with input. So we can do input, and I'm just going to hit tab, And by default, its type is text. So just regular text, but there's lots of different types. There's button, which would look like a button, a checkbox, color, datetime, datetime local, date, email, file, hidden, which is nice because that one shows up not at all, but you can still put information in it. Image upload, month, number, password, radio, research, search, submit, tell, text, time, URL, week, so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. Let's just work with one to begin with, regular text. So this is our element. This is our attribute. Type is the attribute. And this is our value. We're saying it's a text field. Then we can give it a default value and say hello world. And we can give it a placeholder as well. Placeholder is equal to enter your name. Let's go ahead and let's just take a look at what this looks like. Oh, nope. Scroll to the bottom. Thank you. This says hello world. And when I delete this, delete. When I delete this last one, that little text in the background, that's placeholder text. But when I refresh the page, by default, it says hello world. And that's because of the value that I gave it. Now, another example would be password. Let's go ahead, and you can see that it turns it into little dots that we can't actually see what it's doing. So that's the input field. That's really all there is to it. In the next lesson, let's go ahead and take a look at our text area field. Hello and welcome back. In the last lesson, we created an input field. In this one, let's go ahead and create a text area. Now this one is a little bit different. You'll notice that the input field was a self-closing tag. The form was not, so it wraps a bunch of stuff in here, but the input field actually takes a value in the form of an attribute called value. The text area does not. We can get rid of name and ID because we're not doing any of that stuff. We also have a little bit of a rule breaker here where we're saying, hey, this one's not actually using value, the attribute. It's not doing this. This one actually wants us to put our text in here. Now this is interesting because if I refresh this page, it says text in here. But what makes this more interesting is this is one of those rare cases where white space does matter. White space does matter in here. And the reason I'm showing you this is because I have on my first line text in here, but then on the second line, I have like 15 or 12 spaces before the word white space. Let's go ahead and see what that does to our text area. It makes it not very nice. It gives us all the extra spaces in there. So if you ever run into something like this, just go ahead and throw that to the very left of your document, your page, your file that you're working on. Let's go ahead and refresh, and that brings it back to the left. And that's our default value. Now this can also take a placeholder. Placeholder is equal to, wow, a placeholder. Placeholder. Okay, refresh, go ahead and let's grab all this. And you can see I've got extra white space in there as well. Let's go ahead and clean that up. I'm gonna grab all of this, delete, and it says, wow, a placeholder. Now we also have columns and rows, just like a table. We could say the columns, let's say instead of 30, let's say there's going to be 50. Columns go up and down. So this is going to be 30, so 50 is going to be, I'm going to guess, somewhere around here. Ah, pretty close. And then we've got rows, which go up and down. We've got 10 rows here. We could say 5 rows. Let's make it just a little shorter. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then after this, the little scroll bar is going to show up for us. 6, 7, 8, 9. And you can see that scroll bar here. We can also resize these, which is pretty nice. The biggest difference between a text area and an input field is it has columns and rows. The placeholder is the exact same, but the value actually goes between the opening and closing HTML tag. At this point in time, I would like you to give this a shot, create an input, and then create a text area. Don't forget, if you get stuck, you can ask questions down below, or alternatively, you can join the Learning to Code Facebook group, where 56,000 plus members can help you out at any given time. Okay, let's take a look at buttons. What is so important about a button? Well, if we go back to our page here, we have a password field and we've got some text area in here, but we actually don't have a way to submit this form. There's no button to submit this form, and that's what a button does. Now, a button can do one of 3 things. So let's do button. Type is equal to button and click me. So the important thing here is we're saying type, just like our input. Type is equal to password, button, type is equal to button. Now when I go here and refresh, I click this, nothing's happening. And that's because we said type is equal to button. This is largely for JavaScript, where JavaScript can actually do something with the click of a button. For us, this is completely useless. Next, we have reset. Now, reset doesn't look like it's going to be doing anything, but if I go ahead, delete that, and do a bunch of random stuff in here, and click me, because this is set to type is equal to reset, it's going to reset my entire form. So this is going to automatically fill with the default value, and this is going to show up with its default value. Just like that, it reset the form for us. So pretty cool, honestly, not used too often these days. The one you're going to be using most often is submit. And now if I refresh my page and refresh, click me, it actually reloaded my page. And you can see that it went to index.html, question mark, and then put me back to the bottom. Now that question mark is because we're using a method called get. And when that method is get, what we can do is here we can say name is equal to password. And the text area, we can see the name is equal to, I don't know, someone's address, for example. Let's go ahead and refresh this page. And when I submit this form once more, you can see the password is equal to hello world. That's what shows up in here. And the address is equal to text in here, a new line, white space does not matter in here. And so that put it in our URL. Now this is actually a really, really bad practice. Don't put things like your password in your URL ever. That's not really something you need to be too concerned with right now, but I am going to preach it just so that you're familiar with sort of how security works. If you ever put a password or a credit card or a social insurance number, social security number in your URL, Google can take that URL and store it on the internet. And it won't know better. It will think it's a legitimate page. Not just Google, but Bing or other search engines, bots will be able to submit the form and get that information as well. People will share the links with their password in it, things like that. You just want to avoid basically being able to share a password or a credit card number, social security number, social insurance number, anything like that. Anything that's private, you don't ever want to put in your URL. So again, I'm getting a little preachy about security here, but it's really good to know. The thing to note here though is test 1, test 2. Password is equal to test 2, address is equal to test 1, just like we said. And that form is now submitting because we have button type is equal to submit. Okay, let's go ahead and look at drop-down options. Now this one is really interesting. I really like this one, but before we do that, let's clean this up just a touch because our form is looking a little bit gross, and I'll show you what this looks like before and after. So I'm going to add a bunch of divs in here, knowing that a div is a dummy element. It does absolutely nothing, but it is a block element, so it's going to sort of put these on their own lines. And let's do this as well, div. And this is what our form looked like at first. I'll zoom in here. This is what our form looked like at first, and when I refresh the page, that's on its own line, own line, own line. So that's a little bit better in my opinion. Let's go ahead and create one more div in here just so that we can have a select element. And this select element is pretty interesting. So what we can do is name, we can give it a name, selected underscore option. We don't need to give it an ID. And this one's interesting because it works a little differently than the input and text area. What this does is it allows us to use the option element where we can put a value and a text representation of that value in here. So value 1, and we can say this is value 1. We can do the same thing on a second line, value 2, and this is value 2. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like. This is a little drop down now. We can do this over and over and over again. I'll just make a bunch here. Not really a good example, but an example nonetheless. And we can select one of these. Now, the reason why we add a value in here plus the text representation of that value is because if I select value 1, submit this form, you can see up here it says selected option is equal to value 1. And that value 1 matches here. So when you submit your form, your server-side programming language like Python is going to read this value. It's going to say it is value 1. It's not going to look for this is value 1. It's going to be looking for just value 1. Now we can also make things disabled, and we can also make things pre-selected. So let's go ahead and make a new option in here that's disabled by default. Option, value is going to be nothing, and let's say this is disabled is equal to disabled. disabled, just like that. Let's go ahead and maybe throw this on a new line, just so it's a little more readable. And let's refresh our page. Zoom back in. We have an option here that's disabled. I cannot select it. I can select value 1 or 2, but not disabled. Now let's say I have an option in here that I always want to be selected by default. And say default is selected is the value. Selected by default is the text representation of this value. And we can say selected is equal to selected. Selected by default. And so even if I come back to this page and like clear out all this stuff as if I'm a brand new user, I scroll to the bottom of the page, selected by default, even though it's the third option, it has not selected value 1 or value 2 by default, it is selected by default. Now the last thing to know about these form fields is you can make them required. So let's say required and required. So the password and the address fields are required. Let's go ahead and refresh this page. Let's go ahead and clear this out and click me. It says, please fill out this field. Now where this gets interesting is we can say this isn't a password. We could say this is an email address. Let's refresh the page. And actually what I need to do is change that type to email. And I'm going to change that name to email as well. So the default value is hello world. But if I click this, please include an @ in the email address. It knows that it's looking for an email address. helloworld@something.com. Okay, so validation passed this first one. It didn't pass the second one. It wants me to fill out this field here. Once I fill that out, it will submit the page or submit the form for me. Now, this is forms in a nutshell, and forms are incredibly important. They're also quite complex. So I would highly recommend just taking a few minutes and messing around with it. Now, it's not going to be immediately applicable to you right now until you start working with a server-side programming language, again, like Node.js, Python, C, PHP, something like that. But you can still get hands-on practice understanding that something can be required, that it has a name, that it could go in the URL if it's a get method, that the type could be email, password, text, reset. This could even technically even be button if we wanted it to. Let's change that to button and see what happens there. Changes it to a button. Although I like using this form of a button, it's a little more explicit, verbosely named even. And yeah, so just give this a shot and play with it a little bit. Don't try to achieve anything in particular. Just try to break things. See what happens when you type cols is equal to 500 or 1. See if that looks any different. Or rows, or see if you can make this selected, the select element required as well. Go ahead and just play with that. There's no goal here, but I would say spend at least 10 minutes playing with this and just getting an idea of how this works, because these are incredibly important down the road. Okay, welcome back. Let's take a look at embedding some sort of content. Now we do this typically with an element called an iframe. An iframe takes an SRC and a frame border. Well, it actually takes a lot of different things, but the frame border is going to be 0 because we don't want a border around it, but let's add that border in there anyways. And let's do SRC is equal to https caleb.io. Let's see if this even works. Yeah, my website won't let you do that, but you can see that there's a frame border around here, and the example is frame border 1 versus frame border 0. We like frame border 0 these days. It just looks a little bit better. But let's go ahead and add like a YouTube video. So I'm just on the Coding for Everybody YouTube channel. Let's go to the Web Development Fundamentals. Let's pause that. And if I go ahead and click share, I can share on Facebook, Twitter, or I can click embed, and it gives me an iframe, a bunch of code. And I can just copy that. And let's delete this iframe. Paste that in here. And you'll notice it's an iframe. It has a width and a height as well. Its source is the YouTube URL, so www.youtube.com/embed/JYRKIHDGJ-A. That's the unique video ID, I guess. Frame border of 0. YouTube also doesn't want us to have a frame border. And allow a bunch of other things in here, which we can get rid of. Except allow full screen. Let's keep that in there. That seems useful. And so we can go back to our page and refresh. And look at that. We have a YouTube video on our page, just like that. And that's literally as easy as it gets. So that one's literally copy and paste. But let's see what happens when we do width of 900, but the height stays the same at 315. Gets a little bit squishy there, doesn't it? Let's say the width is going to be 900 and the height is 100. And now it actually looks like it's getting cut off a little bit. So there are ways to control this. And I'm going to undo that because YouTube suggested the right dimensions for me. And I can just go ahead and play this. And it just works for me right out of the box. Now, what I would like you to do is go find a YouTube video, click that share link or that share button, and then get the iframe and put it in your page. I want you to get a little bit of experience with this because in the next video, we're going to dive into your final project where you're going to need to use an embed, such as an iframe. Okie dokie, welcome back. We are finally at your final project for HTML 201. Now, here's what I want you to do, is I want you to create a page layout. So I want you to have some sort of header, a navigation section, and a content section. And it has to have a layout, and it has to use tables, or a single table, multiple table. It doesn't matter, I'll leave that up to you. Your navigation should have at least one link to another existing page of yours. Your content area should have an image, a paragraph, a header, and a YouTube video. Lastly, your footer should have a copyright symbol and the year that you've created this page. So it could be like copyright 2020, copyright 2025. And then when you're done that, I would like you to take a screenshot of your page and share it with the rest of the class. I think it's really useful to get some feedback. If you don't want to share it with the class, that's okay. You can always go to the Facebook Learning to Code group and share it with the group and get some feedback there as well. But feedback is absolutely vital. And don't be too nervous about feedback. Thousands of people do this every single day. It's totally okay. We can give you all sorts of positive feedback to help you write better code, to make things look a little bit better, a little bit more modern, things like that. It's always nice to have another pair of eyes on your code. So go ahead and give this a shot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pause this video for about, 5 seconds or so, and then I'm going to create my version of this right in front of you. So go ahead, pause the video here. And you know what, if you get stuck, you can just watch me do mine and then you can try it on your own as well. But I highly recommend that you try it on your own first. Make your brain sweat a little bit. That's really, really important. Okay, let's go ahead and create our project page. So I'm going to go to File, New File, and let's change this from plain text to an HTML file. And the first thing I need to do is create that HTML5 structure. This document is going to be called Caleb's project. And the first thing we needed in here was to create a page layout using tables or a table. And so I'm just going to leave some room for us to work here. And we want something that's going to look a little bit like this. This is the hardest way to draw something, by the way. But yeah, so we could have something like that. So we've got like our header in here. It could say like Caleb's project, Caleb's website, your favorite food, your favorite pet, your favorite furniture, anything like that. We have some sort of navigation on the left over here. We've got content in the right, and then we've got some sort of footer at the bottom. That's the sort of look that I'm going for. Your style might be a little bit different. Your layout might be a little bit different. But the first things first is I know I need a table. And I know I need to work with this table and see exactly what's going on. And I want the width to be 100% of this page. Next, I know I have at least one row here. So I got a table row, and I want the table heading in here. Now, it's nice that the table heading is going to bold it for me, but I don't want it to be bold. I want an H1. I want this to be huge and say Caleb Tollien's project. Next, we have another row here. So let's go ahead and create another table row. This one has 2 cells though. So we do TD, cell 1, TD, cell 2. And let's go ahead and preview this by saving this as my project.html. I can go to File, Open File, myproject.html. And we can see that the cells aren't really working. Now this is expected because we want this to take up the entire width, but this is saying, well, there's 2 cells. We have to display them somehow. What we can do here is th colspan is equal to 2. And this is saying there's 2 cells down here. Make sure this also pretends that it's 2 cells. And there we go. That's looking a little bit better. Now we have a navigation over here in cell 1. So let's just go ahead and label this navigation, and let's label this content. Okay, you can actually see that that bumped my navigation over. Let's change the width here. The width of this one is going to be something like 20%. That looks better. Lastly, what I wrote in here, which, by the way, I could wrap in a pre-tag, is I need this bottom row in here. So let's go ahead and add this bottom row. Table row, TD, footer in here. Let's see what this is shaping out to look like. Not bad, not bad. But we also want this to have a colspan of 2. So let's do colspan of 2. There we go. We've got some footer in here. And we want to center it. So let's not make it a TD. Let's make it a TH. And let's start with the easiest thing in here. So we have our layout finished. The footer should have a copyright symbol. We know that's an HTML entity. It's that little C with a circle around it. So we could say, and copy Caleb's website as of, let's live in the future, 2030. There we go. Not bad, not bad. Navigation, we know that the rules were navigation should have a link to another existing page. So let's go ahead and give ourselves some room to work here. And let's create an unordered list. And let's change this to a HTML file. We have an unordered list, and that first link is going to be an anchor tag that goes to index.html. Index.html. Go to our HTML 201 page. Okay, that's coming together. I'm going to zoom in here. So that's coming together. Let's go ahead and create another li with a anchor inside of it, a list item with an anchor inside of it. And let's tell this one to go to, I don't know, facebook.com. But this is an external link, so we need the https:// and this could say, go to facebook.com. There we go. We've got a couple links in there. We know this one exists because that was the page we were working on, or it's the page I was working on from all the other videos. Lastly, we have some content in here. What did we want to add in here? Content should have an image, a paragraph, a header, and a YouTube video. Let's go ahead and add that header first. And so you actually realize what I did there was content was just a placeholder piece of text for me. All I really wanted to do was tell me that that's where it was supposed to be so I could quickly select it and start working. So let's go ahead and add some header in here. And it doesn't have to be like real content, by the way, some header in there. It just needs to check off this acceptance criteria. So the header is done. We can get rid of that. Link to another page, get rid of that. Create a page layout using tables, get rid of that. Footer should have a copyright symbol, get rid of that. So now we just have an image, a paragraph, and a YouTube video. Let's go ahead and add a paragraph in here. P. Lorem. Okay. That one is done. We no longer need the paragraph in there. We need an image. Do we have any images? Yeah, we've got a computer, so let's go ahead and add that. IMG, the source is going to be images, that's this folder here, /computer.jpg, and the alt is going to be computer, just in case the image doesn't load. Does this work for me? Yep, there it is. There's a big image in there. Let's lastly add a YouTube video. So I'm just going to boot up YouTube here, go to the Coding for Everybody channel, and let's go ahead and let's do Python formatting. Let's go ahead and click share, and let's get that embed. And all I'm doing is I'm selecting that text, going to copy, and down here, paste. And that width is still going to be 560. That height's still going to be 316. I'm going to leave this allow accelerometer clipboard, right, all that stuff. I'm going to leave that in there because that's what Google is suggesting. We don't need to know what that really is at this particular time because this is intermediate HTML, not advanced HTML. Let's go ahead. Let's go back to our page and we have a title. We have some navigation in there. We have a header, a paragraph, an image. We have a YouTube video and we have a footer. The last thing I want to do is get rid of this border and this pre in here. So let's get rid of that pre-formatted text and that border can be removed. And let's see what we got. There we go. We have an HTML page with a proper layout. And that's all there is. So thank you for taking this course. My name is Caleb Tallien. Thank you for taking the time to learn HTML 201 or intermediate HTML with me today. So thank you again for taking the time to learn all of this with me. I really look forward to seeing you in another course. If I don't see you in another course, I hope to see you in the Facebook Learning to Code group. It's a completely free group. It's completely optional, but there's about 56,000 members in there right now. Everybody is willing to help you out at any moment. And if I don't see you in there, then once again, just thank you and happy coding. See you around. Bye.